Hi, and this is Cami Fox for Dog Talk. And today I'm going to talk about the Ingham County, Michigan Humane Society mishandling of a dogfighting ring bust. So, like I said, this happened in Ingham County, Michigan. It involved, I think, 47 pit bull terriers. And even with the dogs, coming through a fighting situation and surviving that kind of turmoil, that they weren't able to survive the Ingham County, Michigan Humane Society, unfortunately. One thing I do want to talk about is I think it's extremely important to open up a dialogue on why rescue needs to be regulated and why humane societies and nonprofit rescue organizations need to be held to the same standards that the states are holding breeders. As you will, see as we go through this, which I'm going to read. This is actually, before we get any further, this is my piece. I wrote this. I have about 3 or 4 different manuscripts of it saved. This came from my brain. So nobody else can take credit for it. It is mine. It is what it is. Cami Fox, Dog Talk. I wrote this piece. I submitted it to an online forum. I'm just going to go ahead and share it here. It did happen a little bit ago. It's not recent news, although I'm sure, there are more recent cases of this. But for me, I guess, like I said, it was really heartbreaking once I started getting into the ins and the outs of the case and to see how so many people let these dogs down, and that the people that were supposed to be rescuing them and providing them with some kind of better life, if that was possible for them, coming from a fighting ring, there's no guarantee that a dog's going to be able to be a pet after a life like that, unfortunately. And the people that hold the ultimate responsibility are the people that fight the dogs and breed the dogs and condition the dogs and then train the dogs to fight and then bet on them to see which one survives the fight. But anyway, so I just want to read from my own piece, like I said, and I don't think that this is a situation that a lot of people know about, although hopefully, that'll change. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So every time I start to research another dogfighting bust, I see a news person that inevitably asks, what will happen to the dogs? And more often than not, it's not a positive outcome. Although that's not true in every case, there are some stellar stories of pit bulls rescued from fighting organizations, the Victory dogs that were rescued from the Michael Vick dogfighting operation. Some of them were able to be rehabilitated. Unfortunately, most of them have passed, but there are Instagrams that memorialize them. So, the number is few compared to the many that are not so lucky. And I debated, at the time whether or not to post it because the forum that I posted this to is actually, focuses more on, the human tragedy of dog fights and fighting dogs and the human victims of pit bull attacks, as opposed to, what happens sometimes to the dogs themselves. And I think that because this is dog talk, this isn't human talk, and I want to talk about what happened to these dogs because They really deserve better than what they got. So I guess I could have used a lot of stories. Like I said, there are quite a few instances of humane misconduct, but this is probably one of the worst that I've ever had to research. And then it occurred after a dogfighting bust in Ingham County, Michigan. And federal authorities raided a dog yard affiliated with a local, dogfighting ring in that area. And the kennels involved had some fairly outrageous names. Stick With Me. One of the kennels that got busted was Fatal Menace. And then there was Corner to Corner. And the dogs that were rescued in this bust had names straight out of like a Hollywood movie. I mean, like, there was Demonville, Dreamville, Wifey, Esco, Hollywood, Missile, misspelled, Monkey, Cardiac Kid, Pox, and others. And, in this situation, there was report after report of red flags. And after the bust had taken place, there were multiple people that were flagging how these dogs were being taken care of, that they were raising the issue. Some of the animal control professionals that were involved in the care of these dogs after the Ingham County, Michigan Humane Society took custody of them. So they seized 47 pit bull terriers. And I guess the dogs were actually seized in Lansing and in 2017. And at the time of the removal, an Ingham County animal control officer stated, quote unquote, quote, end quote, not on, okay. Quote unquote, all dogs were of adequate weight. These animals were not starving. They appeared in good health. I would assume they would have to if they used them to fight. You can't fight a sick dog, I guess. Of these dogs, 30 out of the 47 were rehomed, which is a pretty astronomical rehoming rate, really, for a fighting dog. 15 had to be euthanized for behavioral reasons, and 2 had to be euthanized for medical reasons. According to Dinan, who was a professional there, the typical animal at the shelter will stay for about 10 days. But in the case of these fighting dogs, they actually were there for 181 days. That is a crazy amount of time for a dog that's used to, and please pardon me for having to term it this way, but an animal that's used to being worked and getting a lot of exercise, an animal who is upkept like an athlete, to be caged for 181 days for a court proceeding against the kennel owners. I just feel like that was unfair to the dogs. No animal deserves that. I mean, if, put them, the shelter was just not prepared at all for these dogs. And they did not know about the special requirements of keeping such athletic dogs. And as anybody who has performance dogs can tell you, if you have an extremely active dog, if you're one of those people, say you're in agility all the time, you have to feed your dog if you want to win. And, you have to make sure that their nutrition is balanced, that they're getting enough protein, that you're keeping them at a good weight for them so that they can compete. They have to be lean and muscular, and you don't want a whole lot of fat on them, but you want them, in prime shape. And sometimes that requires, especially if it's a really young, larger breed dog, sometimes that can require a lot of kibble. They eat a lot. They have to maintain the body weight. So anyway, it looks like, according to, the ICAC, which is the Ingham County Animal Control which is ICAC. That's the official term for the shelter. They process about 3,000 animals every year. The year that the fighting ring was busted, 2017, they saw fewer animals in total. But because of the huge bust that occurred in the summer, they were at capacity. And I guess not only were they at capacity, they were actually over capacity. Pardon me, and they were 50% over capacity. That's a very, very significant. John Dinan was the director of the Ingham County Animal Control at that time. And to, I guess, cope with the flow of dogs, they opened an auxiliary shelter in a garage. Like an actual garage. And they borrowed kennels, I guess, and they would visit the building twice a day, and they would rotate the dogs into the main shelter as space became available. I don't think that the dogs were ever intended to stay in that facility for as long as they did. Definitely don't think that was appropriate. The auxiliary shelter that they were using to sort of house these animals was not registered at all with the state of Michigan, so they did have a violation. There was an animal care specialist, and her name was Michelle Jelinek. And she told an investigator with the state who was investigating the allegations of cruelty, that were directed at the shelter for their mishandling and the terrible care that these dogs received, that they were overwhelmed with the 50 dogs. I guess there weren't 50, there were 47. But that the shelter was overwhelmed with the 50 dogs from the fighting ring. And there were too many dogs to give them adequate attention. And their care boiled down to feeding, sanitation, and medical needs. These dogs probably aren't getting a whole lot of human contact or attention. Probably not getting any exercise. And we'll go into what that causes a little bit later in this piece, but there is a medical term for what happens to dogs after they spend too much time in a shelter. Some of them can start exhibiting significant behavioral issues that could lead to their euthanization. Now, shelters and rescues are extremely stressful situations for dogs, unless it is a foster situation, and the dog is like living in a home as opposed to in the actual shelter itself. So as this investigation that the state of Michigan was doing into this animal shelter geared up, they focused on one dog who, I think the shelter may have renamed it, but the shelter named the dog Dreamville, and I'm pretty sure that was actually Demonville from the bust. So, it's important that we be able to at least try to correlate the names that the shelter gives the dogs to the dogs as they were taken from the fighting rings. So we're going to say that this is Dreamville/Demonville. And there were 4 other dogs as well. Employees gave conflicting statements on Dreamville's aggression, feeding, and other concerns. And they didn't really provide a whole lot of information. They said that there was little conclusive evidence that came from the shelter workers about, and we'll, get into Dreamville's condition later and what happened to that dog, but that the shelter workers weren't able to provide good testimony on what exactly occurred to that dog. Probably because they didn't want to get in trouble, but, nonetheless. So there was little evidence as to how the dog received so little nutrition basically they starved them. The seizure of the dogs overwhelmed the shelter, and the Ingham County Animal Control Shelter struggled to care for the dogs due to their background. And Dinan told the State Journal in June that a veterinarian, another veterinarian expressed concern about the care the dogs received. And the shelter, based on that veterinarian's concern and testimony, they reached out to the Michigan Humane Society to open the investigation. So, what was found was that 5 dogs at the shelter, now these are the dogs that came from the bust, did not receive adequate medical care. They have these dogs listed as Bebe, JJ, Dreamville, Scully, and Jonah. Bebe was a pointer mix. She didn't actually come in from the bust. She did have reactivity issues. And pointers are also extremely athletic dogs. They really need a job. They're so smart. She, like I said, she was not part of the dogfighting bust. And according to reports, officials ignored a vet's recommendation to perform an x-ray on one of the pit bulls that had come in. And the dog suffered for 8 days without medical care before being euthanized. And why they ignored the vet's request to scan the dog, I don't know. Clearly they were worried about something being in the stomach in the first place if they wanted the dog scanned. So another dog died from internal bleeding 3 months after coming to the shelter. So 3 months after the dog bust, this dog died of some kind of internal hemorrhaging. Others were emaciated due to diarrhea from whipworm infections. How nasty was this Humane Society? Ew, can you imagine those conditions? Can you imagine that many dogs being kept in a garage? I bet that was terrible. I bet it was just terrible. But anyway, it was said that the shelter did not monitor these animals carefully enough. 2 of the dogs were recovered and rehomed. And I believe that those were the 2 puppies, the 2 pit bull puppies, Jonah and Scully, I believe survived. According to the investigation, the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development had sufficient information to believe that the Ingham County Animal Control Shelter violated their ordinance, which is called the Pet Shops, Dog Pounds, and Animal Shelters Act, MCL 287.331 and all, in accordance with their statute there. So per the allegations, the management, which is John Dinan, operated an animal control shelter that was not properly registered with MDARD, and they called it the Cogen building, which was a large service garage and storage building attached to the Ingham County Sheriff's Office, and it was used to impound and care for 25 of the dogs, it says. So maybe they weren't all shoved in there, but it looks like at least 25 of them were. And it wasn't inspected prior to being converted from a garage. The specific rules broken included failing to sanitize primary enclosures for dogs often enough to prevent a disease hazard. Michelle Jelinek stated, due to the animal care staff being overwhelmed, that sanitizing kennels was not done with any regularity. That the management also failed to provide a sufficient number of employees to maintain the level of husbandry practices required by the statute. And she said that because of the mismanagement of the shelter, that the staff was so overwhelmed, they decided to spend more time taking care of the animals and less time documenting. Let's take that. Let's just read that again. Now remember, these dogs, from what the complaint is saying, they didn't sanitize enough. That they failed to, maintain the sufficient number of employees. And they're saying that they spent more time cleaning up after the animals than they did documenting. So, I mean, that sounds like it's a pretty desperate situation there. Um, so, and to go on, I wanted to talk a little bit about the dogs that suffered. And it took kind of a while to figure out what happened to each dog because the shelter renamed them, and you just kind of had to guess. But there's enough information to correlate the animal control report for the dog from the dogs that came in with what is available for the intake sheet at the shelter, and so you can kind of get an idea of which dog was who in the shelter system. But Dreamville suffered quite a bit. Dreamville was actually a female dog, and she suffered from kennelitis, and this is what I want to talk about. It's actually like a medical term, and it basically means that the dog goes crazy from confinement. So it says that she suffered quite a bit. She lost her mind from lack of stimulation, from being in a kennel because she had been in confinement so long. And JJ, who was one of the other fighting dogs, died of what one vet called possible rat poisoning. Where did this dog get rat poisoning? The vet said that it was possible that someone gave the dog too much ivermectin, which is, if you're not a dog person, ivermectin is commonly used to treat parasites, worms, stuff like that in dogs. There were two puppies in Scully and Jonah, and they nearly died. They were nearly starved to death due to the whipworm infestation. However, according to the intake form, both puppies were really healthy, and that's what you have to remember. Like, before they came to the Ingham County shelter, these dogs were at the right weight, and they were healthy. And they were taken away because obviously you can't fight dogs. It's terrible. You can't condition dogs to be fighting dogs. It's illegal. It's a federal crime. You can't do it. And then the shelter just really dropped the ball. Pardon me. I wasn't able to find out how Scully and Jonah did after they were adopted. They were adopted. They did make it. They were adopted into individual homes. So, and I don't know who adopted them. I really hope that they took into consideration that these dogs came from fighting bloodlines and that they hired a good behaviorist for them. So, and I guess I had some takeaways that I wanted to share. So as I kind of went into before, fighting dogs